Right, good morning, everyone. My name is Phil Minns. I'm one of Her Majesty's Inspectors and also the Specialist Advisor at Ofsted for Early Years and Primary. And what I'm going to do is just take you through, sort of for the next 15 minutes or so, some key messages from us that tie in with the reforms to the EYFS. Obviously, the DfE and Ofsted are two separate entities, but there is some work that's crossed over, particularly around workload and some of the work that we've done in changing our inspection approach to address workload in the same way that DfE have identified and decided to address some workload issues. So hopefully that will come through in the presentation. I'm going to whip through this. 15 minutes isn't very long, so I'm going to gabble probably, but there is the opportunity for questions at the end if anything that I'm saying doesn't come through too clearly. So the first thing that I'm just going to start off talking to you about is a bit around data and workload and some of the decisions that we made when revising and updating our inspection approach that took those things into account, particularly when we're looking at younger children. Now, our Chief Inspector, Amanda Spielman, revised our strategy when she started as the Chief Inspector, and this is her strategy. It's the focus of our work now is very much more being a force for improvement through intelligent, responsible, and focused inspection and regulation. The desire to be a force for improvement doesn't remove the fact that we inspect and we have to call things out if we think they need to change. But the overarching purpose of our work should be to improve the quality and provision that children receive. And so almost immediately after this change to our strategy, we began to review the inspection frameworks and identified some sort of unintended consequences of the way that we were inspecting. And some of that came down to data and the role that data was playing in education. And sometimes the data and the accountability that came alongside it, or the notion of accountability, was actually taking people away from doing what we wanted them to do, which was to teach children, and get children to know more than they could before. So we know in the early years that children are best when they've got high quality interactions from adults. And sometimes the load, if you like, of assessment and the drive towards data was taking adults away from working directly with children and actually spending more time observing them and completing sheets and tick lists and things like that. And so we wanted to remove anything from our inspection framework which would promote that or support it. And there's a very clear message in our new inspection framework. And when I say new, it still feels new to me, but that's because we introduced it in September 2019. And of course, we only then used it for about 6 months before lockdown happened, since when we haven't been inspecting. So that new framework was very much aimed at reducing that workload. And there's a clear message from us to all providers for early years, which is don't do anything for Ofsted. There is no requirement on you to do anything for us. You shouldn't be thinking, well, Ofsted need that or Ofsted will want to see that. What you need to be doing is the things for your children. And what we'll be interested in is what you're doing for your children. Okay, so worry about your children and we will come in and see what you're doing. And I know it's easy to say don't worry about Ofsted, but what we're interested in is what you're doing with the children. So that's the sort of bottom line. So back to this slide, this was the case for change around the inspection framework at the time. What we realized was that sometimes children's learning was coming second to the assessment. So rather than actually teaching the children new stuff or helping them to learn something new, we were actually waiting to see whether they could do it or not. And so we wanted, if our inspection was influencing that, we wanted to change it. Because what we know is that that narrows the curriculum. And when the curriculum is narrowed, when it aims at a smaller range of things, the children who are most badly affected are the disadvantaged and the least able. Now, the easiest way to think about narrowing the curriculum is when we look at older children, because things are more straightforward as children get older. So if we think about, for example, a French GCSE, it might be that in a French GCSE, there are 7 areas of study. And in the exam, when you get to the GCSE exam, only 3 of those areas actually come up in the exam. So what can happen sometimes is the curriculum is narrowed. So actually children only learn those 3 subjects and then they can still get the GCSE. It reduces the likelihood of them getting good GCSE, but they could still get the GCSE. And that hits the target but misses the point, because If the target is to get a GCSE, yes, that's okay. But actually the point of education is all of that knowledge that children need. And of course, that child who's then got their French GCSE, as soon as they then go on holiday to France or decide to do French at A level, they haven't got the knowledge they need. They haven't got that broad knowledge that they should have achieved by studying that for GCSE. Because tests only test a sample, they don't test the entire knowledge. Now, we also see the impact of that in the early years. Sometimes the drive towards the EYFSP, that end of EY assessment, narrows the curriculum for the children. And the way that that narrowing happens could be around some specific areas of learning, where there's a pressure to deliver children to have certain levels in specific areas so that they can get a good level of development. And we would want everyone to have a good level of development, but we want them to have it because that's actually an indicator of the depth of their knowledge in all areas, not by narrowing towards parts and taking children away from some of the stuff that is going to hold them up later on. And I'm thinking particularly of prime areas of learning. When we look at children who struggle when they get into, for example, Key Stage 2, into a junior part of the primary school, often it's things to do with their prime areas of learning if those aren't secure from the early years. So if they haven't got that broad vocabulary that they need, if they just don't know all of those concepts and words that they would get from that early learning, if they haven't got the personal, social, emotional development right, then they're going to struggle. So it's, that hitting the target and missing the point can happen in the early years exactly the same as everywhere else. And sometimes those children move on without the stuff that they really need from the early years. And those things around prime areas, children really have to get in the early years because they exist within the curriculum in the early years. They don't exist in the curriculum later on. They're not able to be given the emphasis later on. And the early years is where those things are best taught, and it's where we've got the people who know about it best. So that's the focus on this, is moving away from that idea of the data driving things, and actually much more about the real substance of education and what children are learning on a day-to-day basis. And just to back that up, really, when we're looking at our inspection and what we'll be looking at on inspection, this is an excerpt from the foundation stage. We inspect against it because it's the statutory requirement. And there it says, assessment should not entail prolonged breaks from interaction with children. It shouldn't have excessive paperwork. It's really important. Assessment is very important, and I'll talk to you a little bit about assessment in a moment. But that whole drive towards data, we have to question if that's actually doing the right thing for our children. What we do, like I said, those high quality interactions with children is what helps them to learn. If we've got adults spending a lot of time doing things that are taking them away from that, those things have to be really valuable. And some of that data drive, I'm not sure that it's that valuable. Right, into the curriculum. We did a lot of work on the curriculum before we launched our new inspection framework, because then we know the curriculum is where we will see the substance of education. There was some concern when we started doing the research into the curriculum that people thought we were going to come up with an Ofsted curriculum or what we expected to see. And that really wasn't the case. What we needed to do was determine what the curriculum was so we can see it when we're on inspection. Because everyone uses different words and different terminology to describe it, but we need to be able to find the curriculum and look at it in a nursery setting, the same as we can do it in a further education place or a secondary school or a sixth form college. And so what we've come up with is our own definition of the curriculum, which is this. Very straightforward curriculum definition. The curriculum is simply the framework for setting out the aims of a program of education, and it includes the knowledge and the skills to be gained at each stage. It's actually setting it out. If you think about, you've got your children arrive with you and they can do some stuff. And by the time they leave you, you want them to be able to do some more stuff. And there's a gap in between those two times, and you're then pacing it out. And you're working out how you can get them to where you need them to be by the time they finish from where they are when they start. That's a curriculum. When we look at the early years, there's the broad approach to the curriculum is laid out in the EYFS, in the educational programs, in those 7 areas of learning. But even in the revised EYFS, they're still quite short. They don't contain sufficient information for you to know what you're doing on a sort of day-to-day, week-to-week basis. And so that's why we've got in our and this is an extract from our framework, that's where we recognise that those educational programs provide the curriculum framework that leaders then build on to decide what they intend children to learn and develop. So one way of looking at it is to say that the EYFS provides the skeleton of the curriculum, but it's up to you to put the meat on the bones based on what you know about your children and how you know they, the progress that they're going to make, the progression they're going to need to make. You do that and sort that out. And from our point of view, that's where the New Development Matters document comes in. It is not a statutory document, so we will not be inspecting against it, and we won't be expecting everyone to be using it. But what we do anticipate is that everyone has to go through that process of taking those big educational programs and turning them into something that you can deliver, and adding that detail and the meat on those bones. So we anticipate that people will use Development Matters or something like it. People might be choosing to do that themselves, or be, finding something else to use. But whatever it is, what we need to make sure when we're inspecting, we'll be making sure that whatever way you do that delivers the requirements of the early years foundation stage and meets the needs of the children in your setting. But one way of looking at the curriculum is, and the way that we would see it, is as a progression model. So the curriculum, like I said, sets out the steps, the pathway for children to get from where they are to where you want them to be. And the clear, good, strong curriculums do that thinking before the children are there. We're not sort of making it up whilst we're going along. We've actually thought about it. And I'll give you a quick example, which is nothing to do with the curriculum, really. It's just trying to choose a simplified example to show you what I mean by a curriculum being a progression model. And I'm going to talk to you about bicycles. So imagine that all we had to do was get children to ride bikes. How easy our life might be. So I'm going to give you a progression model. I want you to imagine that we're in a very large sports hall. We're all looking at a wall. And in the left-hand corner of that wall, there is a bike appropriate for a 2-year-old. Okay, probably, let's have a balance bike, one of those nice wooden ones with big rubber wheels. And then in the right-hand corner, at the other end of this long wall, we've got a bike that's appropriate for a 16-year-old. It might be something off-roady. It could be a road bike, one of those lightweight things with about 40 gears, something where you probably have to wear Lycra to actually get onto it. So we've got those two bikes. Those are the extremes. The 2-year-old is where they're starting, the 16-year-old is where they're finishing, and then we've got all the bikes in the middle, a bit like Halfords at Christmas. We've got those bikes. They'll be increasing in size and complexity as we go from the one for the 2-year-old up to the 16-year-old. You can imagine at some point we'll probably have stabilizers attached to some bikes where we move from 3 wheels to 2 wheels. There'll be gears on some bikes, but they probably won't come right at the beginning. They'll be in the middle somewhere, and we'll probably just start with 3 gears. We won't go straight to 21. That will come later on. So you imagine that's our progression model. And we've got those bikes, and we know that before any child arrives in this place, for most children, the vast majority of children, apart from those with special needs or disabilities that might stop them from being able to do it, for the vast majority of children, if we give them that bike when they're 2, and we give them the support and the practice and the time they need, they will be riding that bike when they're 16. We've done that thinking. That's a progression model. The advantage of doing that thinking beforehand is if you are the person who then, if you're the adult who has to work with the children and get them on that balance bike when they're 2, and you know where they're going next, you know that next year they're actually going to start pedaling, let's say, then you know what you've got to get those children to do. You know where they've got to get to by the end. You know that actually what you want them to do is be confident, be steering, be balanced, and be able to avoid other people, avoid the crashes. These are the things that we're going to want them to do. We can have them all doing it. And whilst they're doing it, we can see how well they're progressing. We can see the ones who've got it. Really great. Let's give them some more chance to practice. We can see the ones who are hesitant. We can see the ones who need an extra bit of help. We can see the ones who might need to do it on their own when there's no one else around. And we can also see the ones when we're in that setting who probably aren't choosing to get on the bikes. And so let's go and help them. Let's go and encourage them. Let's take that time to work with them. So by sorting out what we want them to learn, and that's what we've done with those bikes, that's what we want them to learn, is that bike. We can then focus on how we get them to learn it, how we engage them with it. That's the real um, the trick of teaching, isn't it, for all of us, is to know what we want the children to learn, and then to find a good way of engaging the children in that learning and getting them where we want them to be. So by setting it out beforehand, we make life a bit easier for the people who are actually on the ground doing the teaching, because they know what they've got to get those children to get. Now, this last thing, I'm just going to talk to you a little bit about sensible assessment. Now, sensible assessment is not an official term from Ofsted. I've said that myself. This is me. Because assessment should be sensible. It shouldn't be, it shouldn't take over our lives. It needs to be sensible and thought out. And I would argue that actually the best and most useful assessment is actually, going back to my bikes, when you're stood there watching those children. That's it. It's actually the active engagement of the adult with the child and what they've got to learn. Do they need a bit of extra help? Do I need to get them back in here? What is it that's causing the problem? Why aren't they getting on the bike? You know, is it because that's, you know, why are they falling off the bike? Is it because they're so busy talking to somebody else when they're on the bike that they're not paying attention? But whatever it is, that's the actual, you know, assessment is about engaging in that way. So that's really important, because what we need is for our children to be expert. They need to be expert in whatever they're learning. And when we say expert, that means they've got to have these really deep knowledge in their long-term memory. Now, when we talk about knowledge, we do not mean dusty facts that you get from a book. We don't mean, you know, that sort of, you know, the 7 reasons behind the First World War. Knowledge is simply a piece of information that you need to know to be able to do something. So there's knowledge associated with riding a bike. You know, there's the knowledge of how to steer, there's the knowledge of the direction you're going in, there's the knowledge of balance. All of these things are bits of knowledge. And if we can get them really deeply stored in long-term memory, then children really know it. They're really confident because they're really secure in what they know. They can do it really, really well. That's what we need all of our children to get before they move on to the next stage. Now, I know that Jill's going to appear in a moment because I think I might be running over time, but I will just do this quick bit. Descriptors and mark schemes do not replace a curriculum. So, for example, the goals, the early learning goals, are not a curriculum. And that we shouldn't pretend that they are. We shouldn't be working backwards from the goals. What we should be doing is looking at the requirements and teaching it. And then the goals, when those assessments are made, are a health check. They test part of it. You know, and we can see that in the maths. You know, the maths goals do not include shape, space, and measure. That doesn't matter to us in Ofsted at all, because we know that what we're interested in seeing is children making that progress. So that's what we're looking for. And the progress then comes in these sort of small steps. Let's move on to the next one. I'm a bit worried that I'm showing you a small screen rather than a big screen. Is that right? Or can you see the big screen? Jill, help me out here. Can you see the big screen or the small?
We can see the big screen, Phil. It's fine, yeah.
Brill, good. So I was a bit worried you wouldn't be able to read these bits. I know this is my last one now, Jill. Don't worry, I'm on the way out. So this is where the assessment really works. So the composite activity, the complicated activity, which here I put as singing a large number of songs. If we do assessment that tells us whether they can do it or not, it doesn't help us. It's like getting everyone to run a race. We know who's won and we know who's lost, but that doesn't actually help us get anybody to improve. Whereas if we look at the components that they need to be able to do this task, that does help us. So we look at the components, and here I've put 4 different components down that might be part of this child's ability to sing a large number of songs. If we know that they can pronounce words correctly, and we know they understand a growing range of vocabulary, and we know they're confident in a range of situations, then we start to realize that actually it's the movements that's getting in the way for them. You know, what is probably happening for this child who can't sing a large number of songs is because they can't do the actions at the same time. So they're spending so long thinking about the actions, they can't sing the song. Now, if we know that it's the actions that are causing the problem, we can do something about it. We can help them. We can focus on it. We can, you know, we can all, whoever's working with them can make sure that we work on that bit. And then we get them so they can sing a large number of songs. If all we think of is they can't sing a large number of songs, so let's just keep making them do it. Let's make them do those large number of songs more and more frequently. Actually, what's probably going to happen is they're just going to like it less. Any pleasure they had out of singing is going to disappear because it's just constantly reminding them of something they can't do. As soon as we identify these component parts, and if that's where our assessment sits, That's much more helpful because it means that when we're then doing those teaching activities, we know what bits of gold we want left at the end of the session. And that's what's so important. What are the golden nuggets? Those things that's really important for the child to learn. And if we can focus on those bits, then actually we take that child forward much more quickly. So the assessment should be identifying the reasons why they find some things difficult. And then when we're teaching, we can focus on those and help those children to make progress. Now, my last slide here is just one. I've just taken some pieces out of the handbook just to show you that the curriculum features really, really heavily in it and appears everywhere. And if you haven't read it, I would suggest you do because it'll set it all out for you and hopefully make sense.